The General Assembly is now voting on Draft Resolution A/ES10/L27, entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations.
That was the sound before a vote at the United Nations General Assembly on Tuesday on a ceasefire resolution for the war in Gaza. The Tuesday meeting of the General Assembly followed last Friday's meeting of the UN Security Council, which considered a similar resolution. The U.S. vetoed that resolution in a vote 13 in favor, 1 against, and 1 abstention, the abstention being the United Kingdom. Tuesday's vote showed an overwhelming majority of the membership of the United Nations favoring the ceasefire resolution. That was 153 in favor, with 10 against and 23 abstentions. The 10 against were Austria, the Czech Republic, Guatemala, Israel, Liberia, Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, Paraguay, and the United States. For more on that, we spoke with journalist Stephen Sefton from Esteli, Nicaragua. Stephen? We witnessed yesterday the overwhelming adoption of a ceasefire resolution by the General Assembly. There's 153 out of 193 possible votes voted in favor of that resolution. You want to talk about this?
Well, and I think it's very important in the sense that it shows that although many of us criticize the United Nations system, it does actually work when the United States doesn't apply its extraordinary power with the veto. And I think the Russian ambassador to the United Nations actually said that, or said something to that effect yesterday, when he noted that the system is in fact working, but what makes it what obstructs its actual implementation, the actual implementation of these kinds of really fundamental resolutions, is the action of the United States and its allies, in particular through their use of their abuse of the veto power. Now, there are people that argue, for example, the International Commission of Jurists, which is a very prestigious organization of international lawyers, has appealed to governments around the world, what some people call the international community. They've appealed to the international community that for some government to invoke the Genocide Convention and accusing Israel in the International Court of Justice, which is an organ of the United Nations, which is very different from the International Criminal Court. And it's interesting to note that while some governments have in fact tried to indict individuals in the Zionist government in Tel Aviv to the International Criminal Court, none of these governments have taken the option of invoking the Genocide Convention. Now, why is that important? The argument by very prestigious international lawyers is that by invoking the Genocide Convention, the International Court of Justice is then able to issue a judgment, and that judgment can then be presented to the Security Council. If the Security Council cannot implement that judgment, then the judgment passes for ratification and approval by the United Nations General Assembly. And that judgment, in that context, apparently, according to these prestigious international lawyers, is binding on all governments. That's why although often a lot of us criticize the UN system because it's not a democratic institution in the sense that the General Assembly, which is where all nations are represented, as opposed to the limited representation in the Security Council, the General Assembly, with that vote, can express the democratic will of the great majority of the world's governments, such that they will be able to enforce and avoid the US veto in the Security Council, the judgment of the International Court of Justice. Now, why hasn't that happened? And it's a very good question. It's why people should be asking, why has our government not invoked the Genocide Convention, which is very clear in setting out what the crimes are that would enable a country, or a government rather, to be indicted under its terms, under the terms of the Genocide Convention.
Yeah, let me do a quick on that part. The convention defines genocide as any of 5 actions committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, by the way, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And the 5 acts are killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily or mental harm, imposing living conditions intended to destroy the group, preventing births, and forcibly transferring children out of the group. And if the victims are targeted because of the real or perceived membership of a group and not randomly, and it finally criminalizes complicity, attempt, or incitement of the commission of those crimes.
And all of those, and Israel has very explicitly and very brazenly and publicly engaged in it's violated all those 5 terms of the Genocide Convention. So the mystery is, why is it that governments around the world have failed to invoke the Genocide Convention, which would enable the UN General Assembly to kind of evade the effects of the US veto in the Security Council.
And so you've got this. We're going to distinguish them again. I mean, you've done this already. You've got the International Criminal Court, which is the creature of a treaty known as the Rome Statute, which has groups of countries that have signed on to it, adopted it, and all of that. The United States is not a member of that. Russia is not a member of that. A number of other countries are not members of that. Nevertheless, the United States has a tremendous amount of influence there, and generally the ICC indicts people that the United States wants indicted. The International Court of Justice is a creature of the UN Charter. The members of the UN are all subject to the ICJ, as it's called, and any one of the 193 members of the United Nations, I'm not sure if you have to be in good standing, there's maybe a half dozen countries that owe back dues or whatever, can refer a case for prosecution to the International Court of Justice. That's what you've been saying, and that hasn't happened yet, and that's what we're puzzling over. However, it's interesting to note that even though the ICC does not include the U.S. or Russia among its members, it has indicted President Vladimir Putin for the 5th leg of that crime of genocide, which is the forcible transfer of children out of the group. When Russia transferred children out of a war zone into a safe space.
Yeah, and ridiculous. It's a completely ridiculous abuse of the Genocide Convention, and that's just what you'd expect from the International Criminal Court, which has a notorious record of never holding to account the governments of the United States or governments of the European Union or the United Kingdom for the war crimes of which they have undoubtedly been guilty from Iraq to Afghanistan and elsewhere. So, I know practically nobody takes the International Criminal Court seriously as an impartial body. Of course it's not. It's a kind of tool of the NATO powers in their continuing abuse of the whole issue of human rights around the world.
Well, the African Union members refer to it as the International African Court because up until Miroslav, what was his name, in Yugoslavia, from Serbia, Milosevic, well, everyone was African that was indicted by the ICC. And
Milosevic wasn't actually subject to the International Criminal Court. It's the Special Tribunal on Yugoslavia, and it's called the Special Tribunal. And
he won his case, by the way. He won an acquittal.
Yeah, exactly. But unfortunately, he died in jail.
Okay, Stephen, thank you very much, and we'll speak with you again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Don.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.